If the one broken thing in your life began telling the truth more clearly than time itself, would you believe it or be buried alive for doubting? The sun hung 2 fingers above the eastern peaks when Thomas Garrett emerged from the Copper Bell mine, his broken pocket watch showing 6:30, though the light said closer to 7. He tucked the timepiece back into his vest, feeling its familiar weight against his ribs, a weight that had grown heavier these past 3 months since the gears had seized. "Time to quit fooling with that dead thing," said Pete Morrison, shaking rock dust from his hat. "What good's a watch that can't keep proper time?" Thomas pulled his coat tighter against the November cold. "Still wins, still ticks. Ticking don't make it right." Pete spat into the frozen dirt, like saying a lame horse can still walk. The mine whistle would blow at 8 sharp, calling the day shift down into the tunnels. Thomas had 15 minutes to reach the company store for his weekly supplies: salt, pork, cornmeal, a tin of peaches if his credit stretched that far. He checked the watch again. The minute hand had moved backward. At Millfield's single main street, the sun caught the windows of Chen's bakery, where Sarah worked before dawn each morning. Through the glass, Thomas glimpsed her measuring ingredients with quick, precise movements, her dark hair pinned back with a strip of blue cloth. She looked up as he passed, offering a small nod that made his chest tighten. The company store sat beside the railroad depot, both buildings raw pine that the mountain weather had already begun to grey. Inside, clerk Henry Walsh weighed out 2 pounds of cornmeal on brass scales, the metal weights clicking against each other like small bells. "That's $4 even," Walsh said, marking numbers in his ledger. "Leaves you 37 cents credit." Thomas counted coins from his leather pouch. "Make it 3 pounds. I can stretch it. Suit yourself." Walsh scooped more meal into the burlap sack. "That whistle's been acting up lately. Blew early twice this week." Through the store window, Thomas watched the telegraph operator, a thin man named Crosby, hunched over his key at the depot. The brass lever tapped out a rhythm. Dot dot dash, dot dot dash. More signals heading east to Denver, carrying news of ore shipments and supply orders. Thomas pulled out his watch. The face showed 20 past 8, but the mine whistle hadn't blown yet. "Time's a funny thing in these mountains," Walsh observed, following Thomas's gaze to the broken timepiece. "Sun sets behind one peak, rises behind another. Makes a man lose his bearings." The whistle shrieked across the valley, 8:30 by Thomas's reckoning, though his watch now read 8:45. He gathered his supplies and stepped into the morning light, where other miners were already trudging toward the Copper Bell's mouth. Sarah Chen appeared in her bakery doorway, flour dusting her apron. "Mr. Garrett," she called. "A moment?" Thomas approached, conscious of the rock dust on his clothes, the permanent stain of copper under his fingernails. "Morning, Miss Chen." She held out a small cloth bundle. "Extra biscuits." The dough rose too much. He accepted the bundle, feeling its warmth through the fabric. "That's kind. What do I owe you?" "Nothing. They would have burned otherwise." She glanced at his vest pocket, where the watch chain caught the sunlight. "Is that a railroad watch?" "Was." Thomas pulled it free, showing her the cracked crystal, the hands that pointed in impossible directions. "Took a fall down the shaft 3 months back." Sarah studied the watch with careful attention. Her fingertip traced the spider web of cracks across its face. "The numbers are still clear." "Numbers don't matter if they don't mean anything." "Numbers always mean something," she said quietly, "even broken ones." The mine whistle called again, a second blast that meant stragglers needed to hurry. Thomas tucked the watch away and tipped his hat. "Thank you for the biscuits, Miss Chen." As he walked toward the mine, Thomas felt the watch's weight against his chest and wondered what Sarah had seen in those fractured numbers that he'd missed. The sun climbed higher, casting sharp shadows between the mountains, and the day shift descended into the Copper Bell's darkness, while the broken watch ticked its irregular rhythm, counting moments that meant nothing and everything at once. The telegraph key fell silent at 10:43 by Thomas's broken watch, which meant closer to 11 by the sun's honest reckoning. Below ground in the mine's newest tunnel, the silence felt different, thicker somehow, as if the mountain itself were holding its breath. "Crosby's probably taking his coffee break," said Pete Morrison, hefting his pickaxe. "Man drinks more coffee than a locomotive burns coal." Thomas set down his lantern and examined the seam of copper ore that ran along the tunnel wall like a green ribbon. The vein had been narrowing for weeks, forcing them deeper into unstable rock. Yesterday they'd found loose shale, and this morning the timber supports creaked with each swing of the pick. "This drift's getting touchy," Thomas said, running his palm along a wooden beam. "Should shore up these supports before we go deeper." Pete wiped sweat from his forehead. "Foreman wants 2 more tons by Friday. Can't spare time for extra timbering." Above them, the mountain groaned a sound like settling boards in an old house, but deeper. Thomas pulled out his watch. The minute hand pointed straight down, while the hour hand wavered between 11 and 12, as if it couldn't decide which lie to tell. "What's that thing say now?" Pete asked. "Nothing useful." "Then why keep winding it?" Thomas thought of Sarah Chen's words. Numbers always mean something, even broken ones. He clicked the watch shut and picked up his pickaxe. Habit, I guess. They worked in rhythm for the next hour, pick strikes echoing off stone walls, lantern light dancing across copper veins. The mountain continued its unsettling groans, and loose pebbles trickled from the tunnel ceiling like slow rain. At what felt like noon, Thomas called for a rest. They sat on wooden crates, sharing water from Thomas's canteen and eating Sarah's biscuits, which tasted of honey and care. "You sweet on the Chinese girl?" Pete asked, brushing crumbs from his mustache. "Her name's Sarah. And she's not Chinese. Her grandmother came from somewhere in China, but Sarah was born in California. Still foreign." Thomas felt heat rise in his chest. "Still American." "Easy, friend. Just asking." Pete took another drink. "Though I hear she's got book learning, reads English better than most folks hereabouts." "That a problem?" "Not for me. But some in town think educated women get ideas above their station." Thomas stood, dusting off his pants. Good thing it's not their station to worry about. They returned to work, but the conversation had shifted something between them. Thomas found himself thinking about Sarah's careful attention to the broken watch, the way she'd traced its cracked face as if reading a map. Most people saw only the damage. She'd seen the numbers beneath. At 2 o'clock, or what Thomas guessed was 2 o'clock, the mountain shuddered. Not a groan this time, but a genuine tremor that sent dust cascading from the tunnel walls and made the lantern flames flicker. Both men froze, pickaxes half raised, listening to the mountain's warnings. "Maybe we should," Pete began. The second tremor knocked them both to their knees. Thomas's lantern toppled, its glass chimney shattering against stone, but the flame stayed lit. In the wavering light, he watched a crack appear along the tunnel's eastern wall, thin as a pencil line, but growing. "Out," Thomas said. "Now." They grabbed their tools and ran toward the main shaft, boots splashing through puddles of groundwater that hadn't been there that morning. Behind them, the mountain made sounds like breaking bones. At the shaft elevator, Thomas yanked the signal rope 3 times the code for emergency ascent. The wooden platform groaned upward, carrying them toward daylight and safety, while below them, the Copper Bell's newest tunnel collapsed in a thunder of falling stone. They emerged into afternoon sunlight to find half the town gathered around the minehead. The telegraph operator, Crosby, stood beside his abandoned key at the depot, still clutching a half-finished message. Sarah Chen had left her bakery, flour still dusting her hands, and was helping the mine's cook, a sturdy woman named Mrs. Patterson, distribute sandwiches to the miners. Thomas pulled out his broken watch. Both hands pointed to 6, though the sun hung high overhead. "Time don't matter much when the mountain's falling down," said Pete, grinning with relief despite the dirt caked on his face. But Thomas found himself thinking that maybe, in its broken way, the watch had been trying to warn them all along. 6 o'clock was quitting time. Time to stop digging and start paying attention to what the mountain was trying to say. Sarah appeared beside him, offering a cup of coffee that steamed in the cool air. "Everyone's safe?" "Everyone's safe," Thomas confirmed. "Thanks to you and Mrs. Patterson for the food. Mrs. Patterson organized it. I just helped." Sarah glanced at his vest pocket. "Does your watch still tick?" Thomas pulled it out. Despite the chaos, it continued its irregular rhythm, counting moments that belonged to no earthly time. "Seems to." Sarah smiled, the first full smile he'd seen from her. "Then it's still working. Just not the way everyone expects." The next morning found Thomas at Sarah's bakery before dawn, drawn by the warm glow of lamplight in her windows. She worked alone at this hour, measuring and mixing while the rest of Millfield slept, and something about her solitary dedication reminded him of his own ritual of winding the broken watch each morning. "You're early," Sarah said as he entered, a small bell announcing his arrival. "Or late. Time's hard to track these days." Thomas held up his pocket watch. "According to this, it's either 3 in the morning or 9:15. Take your pick." Sarah wiped flour from her hands and gestured to the timepiece. "May I?" He passed it to her, watching as she held it to the lamplight, studying the cracked crystal and wayward hands with the same careful attention she gave her measuring cups. Her fingers were gentle on the tarnished case, respectful of its broken state. "My grandmother had a watch like this," she said. "Railroad issue. She carried it from San Francisco to Colorado when she came to marry my grandfather." "Your grandmother worked the railroad?" "She worked in the railroad hotel kitchen. 20-hour days, 7 days a week, until she saved enough to bring my grandfather out from California." Sarah turned the watch over, examining its back. She used to say that American time was different from Chinese time. Not better or worse, just different. Like learning a new language. Thomas accepted the watch back, feeling its familiar weight. What happened to her watch, buried with her last spring? "But she taught me to read time before she died." Sarah returned to her mixing, folding dough with practiced movements. "Not just clock time, mountain time, weather time, bread time." "Bread time?" Sarah smiled, kneading the dough in steady rhythm. "Bread tells you when it's ready, not the clock. You learn to feel when the dough's had enough rising, when the oven's hot enough, when the crust is done. It's like listening to what time really wants to do." Thomas watched her work, noting how she seemed to know exactly when to turn the dough, when to add more flour, when to shape the loaves. Her movements had the confidence of someone who'd learned to trust signals beyond what clocks and watches could provide. "Could you teach me?" he asked. Sarah paused in her kneading. "Teach you to bake? Teach me to read time, the way your grandmother taught you." She studied his face in the lamplight, as if trying to determine whether he was serious. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because she nodded toward a wooden stool beside her work table. "Sit," she said. "First lesson. Close your eyes." Thomas settled on the stool and let his eyelids fall shut. The bakery's sounds became more distinct, the soft whisper of dough being kneaded, the low hiss of the wood-burning oven, the distant tick of his broken watch. "What do you hear?" Sarah asked. "Your hands working the dough." "The oven." "My watch." "What does your watch sound like?" Thomas listened more carefully. "Irregular. Like it's limping." "Now listen to my hand." He focused on the rhythm of her kneading, steady, purposeful, with slight variations as she adjusted pressure and speed based on the dough's response. "It's like a heartbeat," he said, "but one that changes." "Good. Now the oven." The wood fire whispered and popped, its voice deeper than the other sounds, more patient. "It's waiting," Thomas said. "For what?" "For the right moment. When the heat's just right." Thomas heard Sarah's smile in her voice. "Open your eyes." When he did, she was holding his broken watch in her palm. "This isn't telling the wrong time," she said. "It's telling a different kind of time. Watch time instead of clock time." She placed the timepiece against her ear, listening to its irregular tick. "It's keeping the rhythm of something wounded that's trying to heal." That's useful time, too. Thomas felt something shift in his chest, not understanding exactly, but recognition. "You think it's trying to get better?" "I think it's trying to find its way back to the time that matters to you." Sarah handed him the watch. "What time did it stop working properly?" Thomas thought back to the accident 3 months ago, when he'd fallen in the mine shaft and the watch had struck stone. 3:15. Afternoon. Shift change. "And what happened at 3:15? "I was climbing out early because—" Thomas paused, remembering, "because I'd decided to leave Millfield. Found work with a cattle outfit down in New Mexico. Was going to catch the evening train." Sarah waited while the pieces fell together in his mind. "But I fell, broke some ribs, couldn't travel, had to stay and heal up." Thomas stared at the broken watch face, and by the time I was fit to leave, winter was coming and the cattle work was gone. So the watch stopped keeping regular time right when you were about to leave town. Seems like. Sarah returned to her bread, shaping loaves with quick, sure movements. Maybe it's not broken. Maybe it's just keeping time for someone who's still deciding whether to stay or go. Thomas wound the watch, listening to its limping tick. Outside, the first light of dawn was touching the mountains, and soon the mine whistle would blow, calling men to work in tunnels that might collapse at any moment. But here in the warm bakery, with Sarah's hands shaping bread and her grandmother's wisdom hanging in the flower-scented air, time felt less like a river carrying him away and more like a pool where he could choose to linger. "Second lesson tomorrow?" he asked. Sarah smiled and nodded toward the oven, where the loaves were rising in their own good time. "If you're still here." Thomas pocketed the watch and tipped his hat. "I'll be here." As he walked toward the mine, the broken timepiece ticked against his chest, counting moments that belonged entirely to him. The telegraph key had been silent for 3 days when the mountain began its serious warnings. Thomas noticed it first during the morning shift, change a subtle tremor that made the coffee in his cup ripple like pond water touched by wind. By noon, loose stones were falling in the upper tunnels, and by evening, even the most stubborn miners were eyeing the shaft elevator with nervous glances. "Foreman's pushing too hard," Pete Morrison said as they emerged into the November twilight. "Mountains telling us to slow down, but all he hears is the company wanting more ore." Thomas pulled out his watch. The hands pointed to 7 and 11 impossible positions that somehow felt more honest than any normal timepiece. "Mountain's got its own schedule, and we're not on it." They walked toward town in the fading light, their boots crunching through the first snow of the season. At the depot, Crosby bent over his telegraph key, tapping out messages that seemed to vanish into the mountain air without response. The westbound train hadn't run in 4 days' washouts along the track, according to the railroad company, though some folks whispered about more serious troubles in the high passes. Sarah's bakery glowed warm against the early darkness. Through the window, Thomas could see her teaching young Annie Walsh, the store clerk's daughter, to measure flour. Annie held the brass cup with both hands, concentrating fiercely as Sarah guided her movements. "She's got patience, that Chinese girl," Pete observed. "Teaching a white child to bake. Not many would bother." "Her name's Sarah," Thomas said quietly, "and seems to me we could use more folks willing to share what they know." Inside the bakery, Sarah looked up as they entered, snow melting on their shoulders. "Evening, gentlemen. How were the tunnels today?" "Restless," Thomas said. He knelt beside Annie Walsh, who was struggling with a measuring cup too big for her small hands. "What are you learning, Miss Annie?" "Miss Sarah's teaching me to read the flower," Annie said seriously. "It talks to you if you listen right." Thomas glanced at Sarah, remembering their conversation about different kinds of time. "What's it telling you now?" Annie pressed her ear to the flour sack in a gesture so earnest it made Thomas's chest tight. "It says it wants to be bred, but not yet. It's still sleeping." Sarah smiled, ruffling Annie's hair. "That's exactly right. Sometimes the most important lesson is knowing when to wait." Pete bought 2 loaves of day-old bread at half price, and Thomas selected a small apple pie that Sarah claimed had turned out too pretty to sell at regular price. As they prepared to leave, Annie tugged at Thomas's coat. "Mr. Garrett, can I see your broken watch?" Thomas glanced at Sarah, who nodded encouragingly. He pulled out the timepiece, kneeling so Annie could examine it properly. Her small fingers traced the cracked crystal with the same careful attention Sarah had shown. "It's trying to tell you something," Annie said with the absolute certainty of childhood, "but it's scared you won't listen. What do you think it's trying to say?" Annie studied the wayward hands, her brow furrowed in concentration. "It's saying, be careful. Something's coming that's bigger than regular time." A chill ran down Thomas's spine that had nothing to do with the November cold. Children sometimes saw things adults missed, and Annie Walsh had her grandmother's reputation for sensing trouble before it arrived. "You might be right, Miss Annie." As they left the bakery, Pete shook his head, getting superstitious advice from broken watches and little girls. "Next, you'll be reading tea leaves." But Thomas tucked the watch away carefully, thinking about Annie's words and the mountain's increasingly urgent warnings. That night, he lay in his narrow boarding house bed, listening to the watch tick its irregular rhythm and feeling the building shake with small tremors that came like distant thunder. The next morning brought worse news. The telegraph line to Denver had gone dead sometime during the night, and Crosby found his key completely silent, unable to send or receive signals. The westbound train was delayed indefinitely, and two more miners had quit rather than work the unstable tunnels. At the mine, Foreman Jake Sullivan gathered the remaining crew for a brief meeting. "Company wants us to reach the new vein by week's end," he announced. "That means working deeper than we've gone before." "What about the cave-ins?" asked Tom Bradley, a veteran miner with 20 years in Colorado mountains. "Lost 2 tunnels already this month." "That's why we're going deeper," Sullivan replied. "Get below the unstable layers, find solid rock." Thomas felt his watch tick against his chest like a warning heartbeat. "Maybe we should shore up what we have before we go deeper." "Mountain's been talking to us all week." Sullivan's face hardened. "Mountains don't talk, Garrett. Rocks fall, that's all. And rocks have been falling in mines since Moses was a pup. You scared? You can find work somewhere else." Several miners muttered agreement with Thomas, but none spoke aloud. Jobs were scarce with winter coming, and the Copper Bell was the only steady work in a day's ride. They descended into the mine as the sun climbed toward noon, lanterns casting dancing shadows on tunnel walls that seemed to press closer each day. Thomas noticed new cracks in the support timbers, fresh trickles of groundwater seeping through stone. The mountain was definitely trying to tell them something. At the tunnel face, the copper vein gleamed like trapped sunlight, rich and tempting. But the rock around it had turned soft, almost crumbly, and Thomas could feel vibrations through his boots with each swing of the pickaxe. "This don't feel right," Pete whispered. Thomas pulled out his watch. Both hands pointed straight up 12 o'clock, though it felt more like 2 in the afternoon. "We should get out. Sullivan will fire us, better than getting buried." A rumble echoed through the tunnel deeper than their voices, more urgent than the usual mountain groans. Several miners looked toward the shaft elevator, calculating distances and escape routes. Then the mountain made its final warning, a sound like breaking bones, followed by the shower of dust and pebbles that meant structural collapse was seconds away. "Everyone out!" Thomas shouted. "Now!" They ran for the elevator, leaving tools and lanterns scattered behind them. As the wooden platform carried them toward daylight, Thomas felt the mountain shudder beneath their feet and heard the thunder of falling stone swallowing the tunnel they'd just abandoned. At the surface, they found chaos. The mine whistle was blowing continuously, the signal for major cave-in. Half the town had gathered around the mine head, including Sarah Chen and Mrs. Patterson, who'd brought coffee and sandwiches for the rescued miners. "Anyone still down there?" Sarah asked, offering Thomas a steaming cup. "Don't think so," Thomas replied, checking his watch. The hands now pointed to 6:30 quitting time, exactly as they should. "But we lost the whole lower level." Sarah noticed the watch's suddenly accurate time. "It's working properly now." Thomas studied the timepiece, surprised to find both hands in their correct positions for the first time in months. "Seems like it." "Maybe," Sarah said quietly. "It was never really broken. Maybe it was just waiting for the right moment to matter." As evening fell over Millfield, with the mine closed indefinitely and the telegraph still silent, Thomas wound his now accurate watch and wondered if some kinds of brokenness were actually a different kind of wholeness time, healing itself by its own mysterious schedule. The depot clock read 8:15 when the eastbound train finally arrived, 3 days late, and carrying news that would change everything. Thomas stood on the platform beside Sarah, his pocket watch keeping perfect time for the first time in months, both timepieces agreeing that the moment for decision had finally come. Conductor Bill Hastings climbed down from the locomotive, his usually cheerful face grim with exhaustion. "Tracks clear all the way to Denver," he announced to the gathered crowd. "But this is the last run till spring. Snows are coming early and hard." Thomas felt Sarah's hand brush his as she stepped closer. Around them, a dozen other people pressed forward with questions about mail, supplies, and travel east. The broken telegraph had left Millfield isolated for a week, and everyone needed to know what was happening in the outside world. "What about the mine?" asked Henry Walsh from the company store. "Any word from the owners?" Hastings pulled a leather satchel from the train car. "Got papers here for the foreman, but I heard talk in Denver about shutting down operations till spring. That cave-in spooked the investors pretty good. Thomas watched Foreman Sullivan read the official documents, his face growing darker with each page. Finally, Sullivan crumpled the papers and threw them on the platform. "Mine's closed," he announced. "Company's pulling out till the mountain settles down. Anyone wants their final pay, see me before the train leaves." The crowd erupted in worried voices. Some men immediately began planning to ride the train east, looking for winter work in Denver or beyond. Others talked about heading south to Arizona, where the mines stayed open year-round and the weather didn't try to kill you. Mrs. Patterson, the mine cook, stepped forward with her usual practical authority. "Anyone staying in Millfield this winter needs to think about supplies. Store won't get restocked till spring, and hunting's been poor this year." Thomas pulled out his watch, 8:45, exactly matching the depot clock. Time was moving forward normally now, but somehow that made the decisions harder rather than easier. When the watch had been broken, he'd had an excuse to drift, to avoid choosing. Now time was demanding answers. "I should go," he said to Sarah, quietly enough that others wouldn't hear. "Got some money saved, could catch this train east. Find work before the worst weather hits." Sarah nodded, her eyes fixed on the locomotive's black smoke. "That makes sense. You could come with me. Denver's got bakeries, restaurants. Someone with your skills could find work easy enough. And leave everyone here to get through winter without bread?" Sarah gestured toward Annie Walsh, who was clinging to her mother's hand while her father counted coins for train tickets. "Mrs. Patterson's right about supplies. People are going to need every bit of food they can get." Thomas understood. Sarah wasn't just a baker, she'd become part of Millfield's backbone, one of the people others depended on when trouble came. Leaving would feel like abandoning family. "Train boards in 10 minutes, Conductor Hastings called. "Anyone heading east better make up their minds." Thomas watched other miners climb aboard with their few possessions, some alone, some with wives and children. Pete Morrison appeared at his elbow, carrying a canvas bag stuffed with clothes. "You coming, Tom?" "Got room in my seat." Still thinking. "Better think fast. Next train's not till April." Pete climbed aboard, leaving Thomas standing between two choices that felt equally impossible. Stay in a half-dead town through a Colorado winter with no steady work, or leave Sarah behind and maybe never see her again. Then Annie Walsh broke free from her parents and ran to Sarah, wrapping her small arms around the baker's waist. "You're staying, aren't you, Miss Sarah? Who's going to teach me to read the flour?" Sarah knelt to Annie's level, smoothing the girl's hair. "I'm staying, sweetheart. Someone needs to keep the ovens warm. Mr. Garrett's staying too, isn't he?" Annie looked at Thomas with the absolute trust of childhood. His watch is working now, so he doesn't need to go looking for the right time anymore. Thomas pulled out the timepiece. 8:58, precisely correct. But as he watched, the minute hand ticked backward, not broken exactly, but moving to its own rhythm again. "All aboard," Hastings called. "Last chance for Denver." Thomas looked at the train, then at Sarah, then at his watch, which now showed 8:56 and was still moving backward. Time wasn't broken. It was giving him the gift of a few extra moments to choose correctly. "I'm staying," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Millfield's going to need help getting through winter, and I've got 2 good hands and a stubborn streak." Sarah's smile was worth more than any Denver job could ever pay. Mrs. Patterson nodded approval and began organizing the remaining residents into work groups. Henry Walsh started calculating how to stretch the store's supplies through the lean months. Even Crosby abandoned his silent telegraph to help plan the town's winter survival. As the train pulled away with its whistle echoing off the mountains, Thomas wound his watch and discovered it was keeping perfect time again. The time that mattered to a man who'd finally learned the difference between running away from trouble and running toward home. Sarah took his arm as they walked back toward town. "What made you decide?" Thomas showed her his watch, now reading 9:05 exactly as it should. Turns out, broken time was just practice for choosing the right time. Above them, the first snow of winter began to fall, and in the warm windows of Sarah's bakery, bread was rising for tomorrow's work. Spring arrived in Millfield with the sound of hammers and saws as Thomas Garrett rebuilt the mine's damaged elevator platform under a sky scrubbed clean by mountain wind. His pocket watch, now 6 months accurate, showed 10:30 as he fitted the final board into place, exactly on schedule for the first time in longer than he could remember. Sarah appeared at his elbow with a cup of coffee and a smile that had grown easier over the winter months they'd spent learning each other's rhythms. Looks almost finished. Another hour's work, maybe two. Thomas accepted the coffee gratefully. Train should be here by noon with the new equipment. And the new miners? Some. Companies being more careful this time. Smaller crews, better timbering, listening when the mountain starts talking. Thomas checked his watch again, 10:35. Amazing how accurate this thing is when it wants to be. Sarah laughed, the sound carrying across the valley where wildflowers had begun their tentative spring blooming, or when you stop fighting what it's trying to tell you. Below them in town, Mrs. Patterson was directing the setup of tables for the welcoming feast she'd planned for the returning workers. Annie Walsh had grown 2 inches over the winter and could now measure flour without spilling, her small hands steady with the confidence Sarah had taught her. Even Crosby's telegraph key was chattering again, carrying messages between Millfield and the outside world. The town had not just survived the winter, it had discovered its own strength in the process. When supplies ran low in February, they'd organized hunting parties and shared what they had. When the Henderson cabin caught fire in January, every able-bodied person had turned out with buckets and blankets. And when old Mrs. Kowalski had taken sick in March, Sarah's bakery had become an impromptu hospital, with Thomas helping to carry soup and firewood up the mountain to her cabin. "You ever regret staying?" Sarah asked, settling beside him on the platform's edge. Thomas considered the question seriously, watching the valley wake up to another day of purposeful work. "Asked me that when I was broke and hungry in February, might have gotten a different answer. But now?" He shook his head. "This is where I belong." A train whistle echoed across the mountains, the noon eastbound, right on schedule. Thomas pulled out his watch. 11:58. 2 minutes early, but close enough for mountain time. As the locomotive approached with its cargo of new equipment and hopeful workers, Thomas realized his watch had taught him something valuable during those months when it counted nothing but its own irregular heartbeat. Time wasn't just about minutes and hours, it was about the moments when you chose to stay instead of run, to build instead of abandon, to trust that some things were worth the wait. The train pulled into the station with a hiss of steam and the screech of brakes, and Thomas stood to greet whatever came next, his pocket watch ticking steadily in his vest, keeping time for a man who had finally found his place in the world's larger rhythm. Sarah slipped her hand into his as the first passengers stepped onto the platform, and Thomas felt the settled satisfaction of a watch that had learned to tell the only time that mattered, the time of a life lived exactly where it belonged. The broken watch had found its way home, and in doing so had shown Thomas the way to his. If something in this story touched you, linger with us. We'll handle the rest.